Hi everyone, welcome back to class. Today we're going to be covering chapter 9, which is entitled Escape, Avoidance, and Punishment. We're going to focus mostly on avoidance and punishment. Escape really doesn't change with operant conditioning versus classical. So everything we learned previously in chapter, I believe, 5 should hold true in operant conditioning. Now, in case you need a refresher on escape and avoidance, remember that both are based on negative reinforcement. So that's where you take something good away. You take something bad away. Okay, so escape behavior, you're in the presence of a bad thing. So you're in the presence of, say, a scary haunted house. You're going to escape that haunted house to get away from the bad thing. You want to get away from that aversive stimulus. So your behavior is going to be to leave that haunted house. That's an escape. Avoidance behavior is performance of a behavior to prevent the aversive stimuli. So in other words, if your friends ask you, do you want to go to a haunted house? You're going to say no. You're going to avoid going to the haunted house in the first place. Okay, so like I mentioned, we're going to focus on avoidance today because avoidance has a slightly different theory when we're talking about operant conditioning, and we use it a little bit differently here in operant conditioning than we did in classical conditioning. So remember, in classical conditioning, we talked about I believe the 3-process theory, whereas now we're talking about the 2-process theory of avoidance. So in the 2-process theory of avoidance, there are 2 mechanisms. There's the classical conditioning component, where our CS is a warning stimulus that gets paired with the US, an aversive event. So if an organism has not learned to make the avoidance response, then the CS-US pairing will elicit fear. So once you make the association between our warning signal and our aversive event, then we can avoid it. In instrumental conditioning, which we're focusing on today, then this component, then we're talking about how avoidance response is learned because the response will terminate the CS and then reduce the conditioned fear to the CS. Okay, so reinforcement of avoidance through fear reduction. So we are reinforcing the behavior of our response because it terminates the CS. So by stopping the CS, it reinforces that behavior that caused it to stop, and that leads to a reduction in fear, okay? So with classical conditioning of fear to the CS, this is really a motivation. This is what motivates avoidance, okay? So the termination of that unpleasant or aversive event provides that negative reinforcement in instrumental behavior. Okay, so the instrumental reinforcement of the avoidance response through fear reduction. Okay, so classical conditioning occurs first. That's what establishes the fear. And then the act of avoidance is instrumental conditioning. So this explains the avoidance behavior in terms of escape from a conditioned fear rather than preventing a shock. Okay? So up until now, all we have talked about was the absence of the aversive stimulus during avoidance response. But how can the absence of something provide reinforcement? So remember, negative reinforcement of a response to avoid an aversive stimulus. So an animal could, say, avoid a shock, but after a while, the animal would keep avoiding and would no longer receive a shock at all. So is the reinforcement of avoiding the shock driving the behavior? That's a question. So one thing that's not in your textbook is this, what we call escape from fear experiments, or EFF. So escape from fear. EFF experiments, okay? So these are experiments to see kind of what's happening in that two-process theory. Are we still being rewarded after a while? Is that instrumental operant conditioning still the process that's happening, like as avoidance continues on after time? So in these experiments, then it's separating the contributions of the two processes. So first, we have the training of the CS-US training, so a tone plus a shock with no avoidance possible, okay? So we make the animal experience this tone and the shock, which should lead to fear, right? And so this is our research that's used to either prove or disprove that two-process theory. So classical conditioning and reduction of fear are usually intermixed. So here we've got step 1 is classical conditioning, and then step 2 is going to be that reduction of fear. So later, the animal will be exposed to just the CS, the tone, but now there's no longer a US. But it can now turn off the US. So it can turn off the shock, so no shock will be given, right? So by turning off the CS, or the US, the animal is avoiding the shock. So the second phase, where the animal is able to turn off the shock, lets us see if reduction in fear is enough to drive the response, okay? So more specifically than in one of these experiments, then we've got an animal confined to one side of a box. It could be like the shuttle avoidance boxes that we talked about, right? So there's a 15-second audio-visual CS, so like the tone or a light, then a 15-second shock, okay? Or the shock and the tone could happen at the same time. Doesn't matter. Later, a barrier is removed in the shuttle box so the animal is able to escape the shock. They can leave that side of the box. That's escape. Now, whether you present the tone and the shock at the same time or in a delayed, then we see decreased latencies to get away from the barrier, indicating learning to escape from fear. So that means the animals learned that once that barrier's up, they can leave the shuttle box quicker. Now, that's escape. Great. So there's a clear result of escape from fear learning as predicted in the two-theory process. But remember, that's more escape, not avoidance. So we'll talk about a different experiment that we can do to look at avoidance. So this two-process theory of avoidance explains avoidance behavior that's based on the organism escaping from fear. Okay, so they're not avoiding behavior occurring to prevent shock. They're doing it to escape fear. So they're not avoiding the stimulus. They're not avoiding that US. They're avoiding the emotional response. So the prevention of a shock is a byproduct of the avoidance behavior. So they're not trying to avoid shock. They're trying to avoid fear. So reduction of fear will reinforce avoidance behavior. Now, there is then the question of how do we study avoidance in animals? That was escape and avoidance. But we have kind of noticed that experimental avoidance in animals isn't as easy to condition and it is for phobic avoidance in humans. So we don't really talk about phobias in terms of animals because we can't really ask them if it's a phobia. It's usually some sort of learned fear. But phobias, we can develop with just one presentation of the US, that negative thing. So we only need one presentation to develop a phobia. However, in most animal studies, then it takes multiple exposures to, say, a shock to produce a learned fear, a conditioned fear. Some scientists then wanted to develop a new system, a new method, where we can mimic a phobia type fear, where the animals will develop a conditioned fear of something with just a single exposure. Okay, so this is the avoidance conditioning and phobia paradigm thing. There's not really a name for it. Your textbook talks about it more, but let's walk through how this situation works. So here we're using rats. You can also use mice, but pretty much they're put in this nice long road sidewalk thing. So there's a start here. They can walk down, they can walk back, they can do whatever they want at the beginning. They can just explore. However, when they get to the dark compartment will shock them. Okay? Now notice the dark compartment has black walls all around it. There's no light in there. So there's that kind of signal to them that it not only is it providing a shock, but that area looks different. Okay, so they're shocked once in this dark compartment. Then they're placed back on the start. So the animal will start walking again. And what happens is we can actually turn on the sidewalk, which is actually a moving sidewalk or a conveyor belt. And the conveyor belt will move the animal towards that dark compartment unless the animal walks the other way. Now, the very first time this happens after the shock, the animal kind of just like sits on the conveyor belt or will even walk further down the conveyor belt in the same direction because it just wants to see what's happening. Rats love exploring new things. However, once they get here to the end of the conveyor belt, then the walls of this part of the room are black. So they're very similar to the dark compartment. And once they get to this black part, then they kind of realize, oh no, I'm almost at the dark compartment where I was shocked. So they'll actually run back the other way to avoid the dark compartment. Okay? Now, once they cross these photocells, it's kind of like an invisible laser. Think about like in spy movies when they're like robbing a museum or something. There's all those like lasers crisscrossing across a room they have to avoid. That's kind of what's happening here. But once they cross the laser, the invisible laser, then the conveyor belt stops moving. And that gives them a break from having to worry about moving towards this dark compartment that has been associated with a shock after only a single exposure. So that's awesome that we have been able to show some sort of avoidance to our dark compartment after a single shock. That's very similar to phobias in humans. Now, what if the rats have to cross this photocell more than once? Okay, so the very first time they get to the black walls, they're like, oh no, I'm close, they're going to run back. They'll cross the photocells, the conveyor stops. The next few times, the conveyor belt will move, and every time the conveyor belt goes, it takes less and less distance for the rats to start running back the other way. They don't have to make it to the black side walls to show avoidance behavior. They could show avoidance behavior right here or right here, and they'll move back, okay? And it'll stop the conveyor belt. But what if crossing that laser isn't good enough? What if they have to cross the laser multiple times. So in this experiment, they then had to cross it 10 times. So they'd run back, conveyor belt would still go, and they'd have to do it 10 times before the conveyor belt would stop. So that's really just showing a very strong avoidance behavior that they learn very quickly, and they continue to run backwards to avoid that dark compartment, even when it requires high effort. So that's showing a strong avoidance to the dark compartment, which again, they only had a single brief exposure to a shock in. So this is again very similar to phobias, where people will repeatedly avoid what they are scared of, even if they've only experienced it once. So what we saw from these experiments is that phobic individuals will learn to make the avoidance response very early in the chain of events. So instead of waiting to the black walls, they're going to start making that avoidance response very close to these photocells rather than waiting, because they want to minimize the amount of effort of avoiding, but they will do whatever effort is necessary to avoid a shock. Okay, what about avoidance conditioning and OCD then? So we've talked about conditioning with fears a lot and phobias a lot, but we haven't talked about OCD. So OCD is obsessive compulsive disorder. And in this disorder, then patients experience anxiety to something. And in order to reduce that anxiety, then they have certain procedures that they must follow, certain compulsions, I guess, obviously, that they have to do in order for that anxiety to go away. So this is actually related to avoidance conditioning. So in avoidance conditioning, then you don't do something, you do not do a behavior in order to reduce anxiety of some sort. Whereas with OCD, you're actually purposely doing a behavior to avoid anxiety. So, for instance, a patient with OCD may have to turn the doorknob 3 times every time they touch a doorknob. And if they don't do that, then they get great anxiety. And so by doing an activity, it reduces anxiety. Whereas that's kind of the opposite of avoidance, right? Now, OCD is still some type of avoidance because you're avoiding anxiety, but we call it active avoidance because, again, you're doing something. Whereas avoidance conditioning is passive avoidance because you're not doing something. So these obsessions in OCD are associated with an increase in anxiety. And so our compulsions would then be associated with a decrease in anxiety. Now, because of this relationship between avoidance and OCD, then we've actually been able to come up with a type of treatment for OCD. And that treatment is called exposure and response prevention, or ERP. So your textbook defines this as a method of treating OCD that involves prolonged exposure to an anxiety-arousing event while not engaging in those compulsive behaviors. So it's based on the 2-process theory. And really, it's kind of actually similar to like a flooding exposure to phobias, because what we're doing is that previously, by doing certain behaviors, by doing the compulsions, we've been reinforcing that behavior by the reduced anxiety, okay? So we've been reinforcing those compulsions. So the idea of exposure and response prevention is that we are going to then present whatever's causing anxiety, but not allow there to be a response. So that means we're not going to be able to reinforce those compulsive behaviors. Now, eventually, the idea with ERP is that anxiety will be reduced by being in the presence of whatever is causing anxiety. This anxiety arousing event will eventually reduce anxiety by itself, just being there, and that no compulsive behaviors are required. So by reducing that association between the compulsive behaviors and reducing anxiety, then it can, for some people, help treat their OCD. So they may not have to do as many compulsive behaviors. They may not have to do compulsive behaviors for certain events anymore. Of course, resurgence can always come back. Spontaneous recovery of this can come back. But exposure and response prevention is a great method to kind of try treating OCD for certain anxiety events. Obviously, it's not going to work for all anxiety events, but for mild OCD, this is a great treatment option. So that's kind of it for avoidance. In the next few videos, we're going to focus on punishment.